an honor to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation to share with you some of this work that I've been doing recently that I am so excited about, and the timing could not be better for us to have a conversation today about the question of whether there is actually a war on science happening in Canada today. And I wanted us to think about what does it mean, how do we grapple with the politics of evidence? And I want to start with a question for you, which is, who here thinks that we have the right to know what's in our air, what's in our water, what's in the soil and the foods that we're eating? Okay, so yeah. We think we should have the right to know about the distribution of wealth and poverty, of health and illness, and the impacts of industrial development on our communities, right? So I think many of us take for granted that we should have access to that knowledge. And then the question then becomes, well, who actually does know? Who knows about what's in our air? Who knows what's in our soil? Who does the work to monitor industrial waste flowing out of extractive industries like the oil sands, fracking operations, and uranium mines? Who is conducting the research to predict the effects of climate change? And so I want us to sort of think about these questions together and think about where we want to put our emphasis in the kinds of questions that we want access to. So federal scientists are funded by Canadian tax dollars. And they are the ones generating evidence relevant to public health and safety. They're monitoring industrial waste flows and toxic contamination in our lands, lakes, rivers, and oceans. They're monitoring the health of our fisheries, wildlife, and the agricultural products that we're consuming. And they are charged with monitoring the health and well-being of our populations through the data collected through the census. Federal scientists are generating the data that can tell us about the risks of exposure to toxic chemicals, the socioeconomic trends shaping our population, and the distribution of health, illness, and diseases. So their findings are what we rely on to make informed policy decisions. And government scientists, thankfully, have been doing this work for decades, amassing large quantities of data in their archives and databases. Their research can give us what we need, which is a very long view of social and environmental change. Monitoring is an essential first step in defining the problems that are affecting us now and also potentially in the future. And I'm among many who believe that we can't just stop the research there. We need the monitoring, but what we also need are a wide range of disciplines coming together, including historians, sociologists, anthropologists, legal scholars, philosophers, and many more, including ordinary citizens. We should all be able to build on the data that scientists are generating so that we can contribute to help to shape the questions that policymakers, change makers, and industry are relying on to make their decisions. And so I'm part of a group of people who are really concerned about this issue facing Canada today, and it's quite amazing to see how much the issue has been taken up in the media recently. So, yet the Canadian government, as we realize, has recently canceled the long-form census and replaced it with the National Household Survey, which is a voluntary survey. And this great little diagram here, generated by my colleagues at Our Write2Know, shows us that by the numbers, when the census comes in, 93% of people, almost 94% of the Canadian population responds, but the National Household Survey, only 68% responded. The percentage of Canada's millionaires who are missing from the voluntary national survey is 21%. The number of census subdivisions whose voluntary response rates were so low that they cannot be included in the database are 1,813. And the amount of voluntary data that the City of Toronto says it will use to compare with previous census data is 0. We have no data. In addition to the cancellation of the long-form census, we have an incredible array of federal research programs that have been shut down across Canada. Hundreds of research programs, and I've just actually, I'm going to, for effect, just show you just a few of them that have been cut or curtailed. They include the substance use and abuse program, environmental risks to health program, the cultural connections for Aboriginal youth, the Geoscience Institute, water pollution labs, Pacific Forestry Center, I mean, at random here. The list goes on. And we might start to pose the question, what is happening when we start to shut down research institutes, when we begin to fire all of the scientists who've been doing that research for decades? In addition, we've also, the government has been involved in shutting down libraries and archives, these essential spaces for the repository of research. And this is an image that has been circulating in the media quite widely. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans libraries and archives, a number of them have been shut down, and some of the contents reported to be dumped into these dumpsters. And you know, these are the sites that are going to give us the sort of long-term view of change. An incredible number of communities rely on this data, people who are in fishing communities, but anyone who's living along a body of water, okay, which includes many of our Aboriginal communities, rely on DFO data. The remaining scientists are facing significant constraints that impact their ability. Oh, and has anyone seen this article coming out in the Maclean's magazine? The cover of Maclean's magazine taking up this issue of vanishing Canada, why we're all losers in Canada's war on data, detailing not just the loss of data from the census, but from these wide array of other repositories. So the remaining scientists who are working for the federal government right now are actually facing not just, you know, the risk of losing their job, but they're actually no longer allowed to speak freely to members of the public or to the media. And so there are communications policies in place that have led to 16 government officials getting involved in the request to interview one scientist. And of course, this scientist is working on this marvelous organism commonly known as rock snot. But it is an algae that involved who's implicated in its blooms of this algae are implicated in the shifting climate. Studies of this substance, this amazing organism, are actually crucial for us to understand what's happening with climate change today. And so far, it took 110 pages of emails between officials in the government to finally decide not to answer the journalist's request for access to this scientist.
There was a program on TV a couple of weeks ago about Lake Winnipeg.
Mm-hmm.
And how it's gone on.
And right, and so we're facing all these toxic algae blooms and others. Yeah.
Could you talk a bit louder and perhaps a bit slower?
Sure. I would love to. I will do my best. I get very excited. I get very excited. Okay, I'll try and speak louder. And I don't know if we can amplify the. Thank you so much. Is it better? The volume? Okay, fabulous. Okay, so journalists are among those who are really facing the pinch. And so here's another example of a Canadian scientist who's been studying the devastation in the salmon fisheries due to fish farming. Her research was also muzzled. In fact, she was one of the first whose story broke. This is an article in Science magazine, an international magazine, journal dedicated to science. So around the world, people are actually taking notice of what's happening in Canada. The Guardian recently reported about the suspension of the singer who wrote that song called Harper Man. So he was also a federal scientist. And a letter written by 800 scientists around the world was sent to the government recently to call for restoration for freedom of access to the scientists, but also for access to information for the public. And the Canadian Institute for Public Service Employees has noted that their own members really do feel this effect of muzzling. So there's all of these stories circulating. So we're facing a remarkable moment in our history in Canada today. We're confronting that our right to know about the health of our bodies, our communities, and our environments has been seriously compromised. And the question is, what does this mean for you? What does this mean for all of us? And I'm working alongside a group of academics, scientists, NGOs, Aboriginal groups, and interested citizens who believe that government's constraints on access to scientific research constitutes a serious injustice, and especially where this knowledge bears on public health and safety. And we believe that an informed public is essential to a well-functioning democracy. Like, if we're going to go and vote, we need to know what it is we're voting for, okay? And so in this talk, I want to share with you an initiative that I'm very proud to be a part of. When I stepped into a leadership role here at York University last year, I felt a certain urgency to be of service to the wider community. And I wanted to be able to bring all the energy, expertise, insights that were circulating among my colleagues all around me. I wanted us to make our knowledge count and to bring our expertise to bear on issues that were pressing issues that are facing a broader public. So I convened this working group called the Politics of Evidence to grapple with the ways that many of us are coming to see this war on science in Canada today. So over the course of the talk, what I'd like to do is give you some insights into the ways that scholars in my field think about the politics of scientific knowledge to help you understand a little bit about what the kind of work that we're doing in this working group. I want to tell you about some of the issues that have motivated us to come together in the first place, and to tell you about our first major public outreach campaign, which is a letter writing campaign, which I co-founded, called the Write2Know Project. And as we close, I want us to open up a conversation together on ways we can get communities involved in helping to shape the direction of the research that matters to us. Okay. So the politics of science, and many of you might be like, the politics of science? But science is science, and politics is politics, right? Aren't they supposed to be separate? Well, many of us are concerned about the recent transformation, the recent dictates of a government that seem to be shaping the direction of science. And we're like, oh, look, politics is interfering with science. Science is supposed to be neutral, free of all bias. Well, I am among a number of scholars who've actually spent all of our life's work showing that politics is inside the laboratory from the very moment that researchers begin their work. There is no separation between the inside and the outside of the laboratory. The current situation we're in is one egregious case of the intervention of politics into science, but politics has been there all along. So I am an anthropologist of science, and that might sound very strange to you, but I was actually trained as a scientist. My initial training was in the molecular genetics of plant and flower development before I discovered that actually I'm an anthropologist. And I want to understand the cultural values that shape scientific knowledge. I want to understand how our knowledge comes to be. How do facts get made by scientists, and how do those facts get made to circulate? So over the years, my research is taking me to scientific laboratories, into the scientific classrooms, and field sites where expert scientists are posing questions, conducting experiments, and struggling to make sense of their findings. My work begins from the premise that science is not what we have long thought it to be. Many of us who are not trained as scientists likely assume that science is a value-free, neutral endeavor. Yet long-term observations of scientists doing their work in laboratories reveals that this is not the case. While many people believe that scientists are supposed to obey the dictates of some ideal of detached objectivity, what we've revealed is that scientists themselves are actually quite open to the ways that their subjectivity and their politics and their values shape the direction of their research. In practice, scientists understand all too well the politics of science ongoing inside of the laboratory. So it is often the public's perception of what science is or what it should be that keeps us from understanding the nuances of the ways that science is shaped. So the walls of the laboratory are not impermeable boundaries. They do not keep out worldly politics, okay, or cultural values. The scientists who don their white lab coats and when they walk through the laboratory door do not magically shed their mores, their norms, or their values. In fact, these norms and values are actually integral to their research, okay? Science is, in this sense, a cultural practice. Scientists train in particularly different disciplines, and in the process, they're inculcated. They become part of different cultures and distinct practices of science. So what we have also shown in our work among historians, anthropologists, and sociologists of science, that there is no one unifying science. Science is an incredibly multidimensional, multifaceted, multidisciplinary form with all kinds of different ways that it's happening. So if science is a locally specific enterprise, happening here or here or here or there, a culture's ideas about what it is important to know, right, will shape what kind of science gets done, right? So a particular culture will produce different ideas about what counts as knowledge, what kinds of evidence should be generated, what kinds of methods should be used, okay, and how that evidence should be mobilized to secure facts. Moreover, different cultures have different ideas about how members of the public and how a government should incorporate those facts into our understanding of the world. So science is political because it shapes what we can and what we can't know about the world. How science is funded by a particular nation state is one very straightforward example, especially given that only some kinds of research get funded. Okay? As an example, in Canada today, government funding for academic scientists working at a university like this one, York University, is now conditional on industry partnership. So what does that mean? So if you want to get a grant from the Government of Canada, you also need to secure funding from industry. We can start to ask, how does that shape what kind of research gets done? How does that shape what it is we even can know about, what it is we can study, what it is, the kinds of data that can be generated, the kinds of information we can have as a public? So, and this is that's an example of a glaring policy decision that makes clear the fraught relationship between knowledge and power. Okay, so it's obvious in some ways to us that knowledge can certainly beget power, right? The more you know, the more power you have. We have this assumption. But we also have to understand that the powers that be can seriously limit our knowledge, right? We can also use power to constrain knowledge. But what's even more perplexing today is that we're now seeing in today a new relationship, not between power and knowledge, but between power and ignorance, or what you call non-knowledge or not knowing, right? And so it's, in a weird way, today it's ignorance, not knowledge, that has become a currency of power. Not knowing is very convenient, right? It's really great not to know what's in your water because you'd otherwise have to worry about the industry upstream, right? It's very convenient for us to not to know. So beginning from the premise that an informed public is essential to a well-functioning democracy, the Politics of Evidence Working Group that I'm gathered together, we're asking about, we want to understand, how does it how do we learn about toxic industrial waste? But, what do we know about toxic industrial waste, but also what don't we yet know? What questions haven't been asked? What research isn't being done? And, what should we know about? What should we be monitoring? Now, there are all kinds of things that prevent us from getting to know the world well, right? There are all kinds of obstacles. There are lots of reasons that we don't know about the effects of certain toxins, for example, either because the methods, instruments, or databases that we have currently in use are inadequate, or the very founding assumptions of our research questions are faulty or wrong. That's one reason we don't know certain things. But indeed, the circulation of chemicals in the environments and through our bodies are notoriously hard to study even for the best and most well-equipped scientists. It is really hard work. So on top of that challenge, right, we also have more powerful obstructions. You know, what are the larger social, political, and economic forces that shape what we know and what we cannot know? And so these are the frame of questions that we're trying to ask in the working group. What is obstructing Canadians from knowing about the health of our bodies, communities, and environments? From what is obstructing us from making informed policy decisions? Okay. So I wanted to share with you some of the motivating stories that got us really thinking about how can we, as a group of activists, academics, and NGOs, actually make a difference. What can we do? So here are some of the stories that were circulating that motivated me to convene this working groups. So there are many stories that could be told about what it is we don't yet know, what we can't know, and what we aren't allowed to know about the effects of industrial waste on the health of Canada's ecosystems and communities. We could begin in Alberta's tar sands. And the story a colleague of mine told me about the tour he recently took up to Fort McMurray to visit one of Syncrude's remediated tailings ponds. So you can actually go on a tour bus now and visit the remediation of these tailing ponds. And he wanted to see the first phase of Syncrude's plan to transform its massive network of tailings ponds into an artificial lake district and a future recreation site. The tailings ponds hold the waste water generated in the production of bitumen from oil sands, and Syncrude's promises of a remediated future for this landscape evaporated, however, for my colleague when he stepped off the tour bus and his feet sank into what he realized was freshly laid sod. Just with each step, black ooze came up between the seams of this sod. An orange and green haze occluded his view across the pond. And the pond, which was full of this wasted water, was so vast he actually couldn't see the other side, right? This was not a pond, this was a giant lake. And around the perimeter of this lake, these strange fake trees had been stuck into the ground. They were meant to serve as nesting sites for predatory birds. But simultaneously, the cannons, which were used to scare off the ducks and geese from landing on the water, were going off every minute, right? So it sort of just looked like this giant war zone. He wasn't surprised that the nests of these, for these predatory birds were, of course, empty. And he considered writing to Syncrude and to let them know that it was perhaps too early to be running tours up there. But all I could think was, but it's like 10,000 years too early. And I think that's the grave sadness around this. At the time, I was convinced that we should all be getting on those tour buses. We should all be going to get on those tour buses and witness what is going on there. Sites like these make the concept of ecological restoration seem ludicrous. Once the site of a thriving forest and home to people, animals, plants, and other creatures, what he confronted that day was an apocalypse, and there is no going back. So as Alberta's extensive oil deposits are mined from the sandy soils that lie below the boreal forest, so we have to remember this is boreal forest that's being mined, and processed to produce bitumen, water is drawn out of the Athabasca River at a rate of 117 million meters cubed per year, dumped into these tailings ponds. The production of 1 barrel of oil from the oil sands requires 4 barrels of oil, 4 barrels of water, and 4 tons of sand and soil. By currently 176 square kilometers of that province are covered in tailings ponds. And Suncor and Syncrude's combined current production levels predict that the volume of these ponds will exceed 1 billion cubic meters by 2020. Okay, and in these wastewater slurries are residues of bitumen as well as salt, naphthalenic acids, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, heavy metals, cyanide, benzene, and other pollutants. These are extremely toxic and persistent chemicals that include carcinogenic and mutagenic agents. So, well, what are the effects of this on the communities, the wildlife living downstream? One reporter tried to find out, my colleague at DSMOG Canada, and she made a request to interview the one federal scientist who had been monitoring the toxic load contained in the bodies of the animals living in and around that area, the very animals that the Aboriginal communities and other hunters in the region are hunting for food, relying on as a food source. She wanted to understand what these toxins were producing in these animals. In the process of her research, she learned some hard lessons about who is controlling what Canadians can and cannot know about the health of their bodies, communities, and environments. Her attempts to interview the scientists were thwarted. In her attempt to find out why her request for an interview was denied, she was confronted again by a Byzantine bureaucracy that forced her to wait months for answers. And when she filed an information request under the Privacy Act, she received over 60 pages of heavily redacted emails that had been sent back and forth between government officials. And then following that, she filed an access to information request and found out that her request went all the way up to the Privy Council office of the Prime Minister before it was denied. So, she was never given permission to speak to the scientists, but she did eventually she said she had to send in questions directly, and some bureaucrats in Environment Canada wrote her a sort of perfunctory response to each of her questions, even though she knew that the scientist that she'd wanted to have a formal interview, because they'd connected behind the scenes, had actually written pages and pages and pages and pages in response, which he was not allowed to give to her. Okay, so these are the kinds of situations. What are the injustices of not knowing what's in the bodies of the animals that you're eating, right? And especially for the Aboriginal people living in Canada who are relying on such sources. Okay, so I just want to bring us briefly, there are a whole amazing array of organizations who've been gathering data on and trying to understand how this is all happening. Voices Voix have an excellent website showing us sort of in sequence how new legislation has taken shape to give us this particular scene. Bill C-38 is it was the large a budget bill that was passed that actually gutted many environmental protections. Silence of the Labs is an outstanding documentary you can take a look at to see how through really close-up interviews with scientists who've lost their jobs over their research, including Dr. Peter Ross and 55 of his colleagues who were the only people doing marine toxicology monitoring, and they were the people who discovered that killer whales have 500 times the levels of toxins in their bodies as we do. And they're also a source of food for many people living in the north. Many people have taken up action around this. The journal Nature has been writing about this. Many have called this the death of evidence in Canada. People have been rallying on Parliament Hill to bring attention. And my working group is one of many, many groups who formed part of a coalition that we call the Write2Know Network. And our first publication just came out this year. Canada Watch, just this fall, Canada Watch offers a whole series of articles on the topic of the politics of evidence. It's downloadable from our website. And what we wanted to do was actually create a public outreach campaign, a kind of action that would show the injustice of muzzling these scientists and simultaneously show the government that we have an interested public who actually cares what's in their air, water, and soil. And so we wanted to sort of explore, could we both show our support for these scientists doing their work, but simultaneously expose the communication policies that keep them muzzled? So my co-founder, Max Libreron, who's a professor in sociology at Memorial University in Newfoundland, an amazing activist and researcher, we convened to create the Write2Know project, and we developed 11 letters that were written specifically to federal scientists about their research, asking them to talk about, well, where are the gaps between their findings and federal science policies? And each of those letters is CC'd to ministers and members of parliament, including the critics of each of these ministries, the relevant ministries, so that each letter that is sent is amplified, okay? So the scientists receive one letter, but the ministers and the MPs received the thousands of letters that have gone out, and to date, almost 4,000 letters have been signed and sent on the first 8 questions, and we now have 3 brand new questions that we're launching as of this week. So from Monday to Friday is Write2Know Week. We are getting educators across Canada to bring the Write2Know project into their classrooms, getting students to look around the world today and be like, oh, what's in my air, water, and soil, getting them to write new letters to federal scientists, and getting people to start to sign and circulate this through the broader public. And so we have a question directly on the oil sands, just like Carol Linnett's story revealed to us. We have these letters. They're we're thanking the scientists, right? Thank you for your research. You've done an amazing job, but why is the government ignoring the results of your research? In this letter, takes aim, it says, Environment Canada states that no matter the source, Environment Canada works to track, control, and reduce pollutants in our environment. But then we're asking the scientists, are the pollution levels you found high enough to cause negative health impacts for human and wildlife? How are you applying your findings to improving protections for Canada's vulnerable aquatic ecosystems and the people and animals living downstream? Okay? We want access to the scientists. We want to hear from them directly how their research could better be taken up by the government. These are the people who really know, they're on the ground, they're doing the work. I don't have time, but we have some interviews with both federal scientists who've been fired, but also interviews with federal scientists who are currently working in the government. And Derek Muir, who's actually on a number of our letters because he works on toxics in industrial waste. He says the extent of the geographical spread of a contamination effect raises the issue of what counts as a safe distance from a toxic site. That is a research question. What is a safe distance to be from a toxic research site? And then what happens if animals are moving, across boundaries? We can't control the way these animals moving, and then we end up eating those animals. So the concerns these federal scientists have are grave. Here's a list of who gets CC'd in our letters, in this particular letter at least. And what's amazing is we've already received outstanding response from critics of the ministries who had response to our letter on the DFO libraries and archives, from the Liberal critic of the DFO, Lawrence McCauley, responses on letters on marine plastics, resource extraction, climate models, and the oil sands, by NDP environment critic Megan Leslie and NDP natural resource critic Guy Caron. We got a response. We also wrote a letter on missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls, calling for an inquiry. Why has there been no inquiry when we have an incredible amount of historical and sociological data showing that the kinds of structural violence of racism and residential school systems has had a grave impact on Aboriginal communities? How is that data not being addressed in understanding the current situation? Why is there not an inquiry into missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls? And we got a response from the NDP critic of Aboriginal Affairs, Nikki Ashton, Green Party leader Elizabeth May responded to one of our letters, and as well the deputy critic for Labour, Wayne Marston, and several others. There have been also great efforts in Parliament to reinstate the long-form census and to create a new portal for allowing publicly funded science to get access to the public, led by Ted Sue of the Liberal Party. And we've had, it's just been a global campaign. We have people around the world signing our letters because they recognize that Canada's policies on the oil sands, on extractive industries, on water pollution, on the north, on contamination in the north, on marine plastics, they affect everybody. So this reach has been quite palpable. We've had almost 4,000 letters signed, and many more are already coming in. We have incredible partners from our Write2Know, Evidence for Democracy, Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, Canadian Association of University Teachers, DSMOG Canada, Waste Science and Technology and Environment, and the Technoscience Research Unit. So I want to open up time for us to have questions around this slide. Who should decide what research is valuable? Who should decide what kinds of monitoring are essential? And can the public help shape the direction of research? I saw your hand first.